December 29, 2006. London. A clerk in the British Treasury processes a payment that has been made every year for 6 decades. The check is written to the United States Treasury. The amount, $832 million. It is the final installment on a debt that began 60 years earlier in 1946, when Britain borrowed money to prevent its people from starving after winning World War II. The clerk closes the file. The debt is paid. After 60 years of annual payments, Britain has finally finished paying America back for the privilege of having survived the war. But this clerk doesn't know the full story. He doesn't know that the original loan was $3.75 billion, and Britain has just paid $7.5 billion total, double the principal. He doesn't know that before Britain even received that loan, it had already sold $12 billion in overseas investments at fire sale prices to American buyers. He doesn't know that Britain handed over gold worth $4 billion, surrendered strategic naval bases across the Caribbean, and dismantled the trading system that held the British Empire together. He doesn't know that when you add up every asset Britain sold, every base it leased, every advantage it surrendered, and every dollar it repaid, the total wealth transferred from Britain to America between 1940 and 2006 was approximately $450 billion in today's money. For comparison, the Marshall Plan, celebrated as American generosity to rebuild Europe, cost $200 billion in today's money. America extracted more wealth from Britain alone than it gave to all of Europe combined. And Britain was the ally. Britain was on the winning side. This is the story of how the United States didn't defeat the British Empire with armies. It acquired the British Empire through foreclosure. How America turned Britain's victory into Britain's bankruptcy, how the financial terms negotiated between 1940 and 1946 transferred the wealth of the world's largest empire to America, not through conquest, but through contracts signed under duress, and how the mechanism used to strip Britain became the template for the International Monetary Fund, which has used the exact same playbook on over 80 countries in the past 75 years. Because understanding what happened to Britain between 1940 and 2006 isn't just history. It's understanding the debt trap that controls the global economy today, the same forced asset sales, the same wealth extraction, the same American institutions profiting, just different countries being stripped. Let me show you exactly how it worked. And once you see the mechanism, you'll see it operating everywhere. In September 1939, when Germany invaded Poland, Great Britain was the world's dominant financial power. The British Empire covered a quarter of the earth. The City of London was the center of global finance. The pound sterling was the world's reserve currency. Britain's gold reserves, $4 billion. Britain's overseas investments, €20 billion in Argentina, copper mines in Chile, industrial. Holdings in the United States. The British Empire generated $500 million annually just from investment income, but Britain had one fatal vulnerability. Unlike America, Britain imported more than it exported. Britain was an island that had to import 60% of its food and almost all raw materials: steel, oil, rubber, aluminum. Everything had to be imported. Britain's industrial power depended on global trade. When war began, Germany's strategy was economic strangulation. U-boats would sink merchant ships. The Luftwaffe would bomb ports. If Britain couldn't import, Britain would starve. To fight the war, Britain needed massive imports from the only supplier capable of providing them: the United States. Tanks, planes, steel, oil, ammunition, food. Everything had to come from America across 3,000 miles of U-boat-infested Atlantic. But America in 1939 was neutral. The American public was isolationist. Congress had passed neutrality acts containing a provision called cash and carry. Britain could buy American supplies, but only if it paid cash immediately and transported goods on its own ships. No credit, no loans. This created Britain's trap. Britain needed billions in supplies, but Britain could only pay in gold, dollars, or by selling assets, and all three were finite. From September 1939 to December 1940, Britain hemorrhaged wealth. The British Purchasing Commission ordered $4.5 billion in goods. To pay, Britain liquidated everything. First went the gold. In Operation Fish, Britain loaded $2 billion in gold bars onto battleships and shipped them to Canada, then to New York to pay American suppliers. It was the largest movement of physical wealth in history. Second went securities. Britain ordered citizens to surrender all American stocks and bonds. The government sold them on the New York Stock Exchange, raising $1 billion. Third went overseas investments. Britain began selling income-generating assets at fire sale prices. But selling these investments was devastating because they generated $500 million annually in income that balanced Britain's trade deficit. By December 1940, Britain faced mathematical bankruptcy. Gold gone, securities sold, easily liquidated assets exhausted. Britain still needed $3 billion in supplies already ordered and couldn't pay. This is when Winston Churchill wrote his letter to Franklin Roosevelt, December 8, 1940. Churchill explained the U-boat threat, the desperate need for destroyers and aircraft. But the core message was simple. Britain was broke and could no longer pay cash for American supplies. Roosevelt understood the stakes. If Britain fell, Germany would control Europe and threaten America. But Roosevelt faced legal and political obstacles. The Neutrality Acts prohibited loans to belligerent nations. The American public opposed aid. Isolationists argued Britain was rich and trying to trick America. Roosevelt needed a mechanism that appeared to be a business deal, not charity. The solution was lend-lease. Roosevelt explained it with a folksy analogy. If your neighbor's house catches fire and I have a garden hose, I don't say, "Neighbor, my garden hose cost me $15. You have to pay me $15. I lend him the hose and he gives it back when the fire is out. It sounded generous. It sounded neighborly. But the negotiations behind closed doors were different. This wasn't neighbors helping neighbors. This was a foreclosure. The man running the American negotiation was Henry Morgenthau Jr., Secretary of the Treasury. Morgenthau wanted to help Britain defeat Hitler, but he was ruthless about protecting American taxpayer interests. His position: before America gives Britain a single dollar, Britain must prove it has stripped itself of every asset it possesses. Morgenthau demanded a complete audit of the British Empire, every asset owned by the British government, every asset owned by British citizens, every gold bar, every share of stock, every factory. He wanted Britain's books open to American inspection. The British negotiators were stunned. They were being treated not as an ally fighting a common enemy, but as a bankrupt company in receivership being audited by creditors. The British argued they had already liquidated their gold. Selling long-term investments during a war would force fire sale prices. Stripping Britain of income-generating assets would leave Britain destitute after the war. Morgenthau was unmoved. If Britain still owned assets in America, why should American taxpayers subsidize the war? The most painful example was American Viscose Corporation. American Viscose was the largest manufacturer of rayon in the United States, owned by Courtaulds, a British company. It generated $5 million annually in dividends flowing to Britain, worth $125 million. Morgenthau identified it as a target. He told British negotiators, "Sell it." The British resisted. Morgenthau gave an ultimatum: sell American viscose or Lend-Lease dies in Congress. Britain had no choice. On March 15, 1941, the British government seized American viscose from Courtaulds and sold it to American investment bankers. Because everyone knew Britain was forced to sell, the bankers negotiated ruthlessly. Sale price, $54 million. The company was worth at least $100 million. Britain received roughly half of fair value. The money went directly to the U.S. Treasury to pay for weapons already ordered. But the extraction went beyond American viscose. While Morgenthau negotiated Lend-Lease, another deal was being cut. Britain desperately needed destroyers. German U-boats were sinking merchant ships faster than Britain could replace them. Churchill begged Roosevelt for destroyers. The U.S. Navy had 50 old World War I destroyers in mothballs, obsolete, slow, of limited value to the modern Navy. Roosevelt agreed to give them to Britain, but not for free. He structured it as a trade. In exchange for 50 destroyers, the United States demanded 99-year leases on British naval and air bases across the Atlantic: Newfoundland, Bermuda, the Bahamas, Jamaica, St. Lucia, Trinidad, Antigua, British Guiana. Britain handed America a chain of military bases covering the entire Western Hemisphere. The strategic value was incalculable. What did Britain receive? 50 destroyers, many of which broke down immediately. By March 1941, Britain had been stripped systematically. Gold liquidated. American Viscos sold at half price. Caribbean bases leased for 99 years. Only then did Congress pass the Lend-Lease Act. Lend-Lease was publicly presented as the arsenal of democracy, but it wasn't a gift. It was a lease with implied repayment, and the agreement contained Article 7, a clause that would prove more destructive than any German bomb. Article 7 stated that in return for Lend-Lease, Britain agreed to eliminate discriminatory treatment in international commerce after the war. This was diplomatic language for destroying imperial preference. Imperial preference was the economic foundation of the British Empire, a tariff system that made British goods cheaper in empire markets than American goods. This protected British industry from superior American competition. By signing Article 7, Britain agreed to dismantle imperial preference after the war. It was economic suicide, but the alternative was immediate starvation. British negotiators fought against it. Churchill overruled them. Article 7 was signed. From March 1941 to August 1945, Britain received $31 billion in Lend-Lease aid. This kept Britain alive. Without it, Britain would have been starved into surrender by 1942. But while Britain received aid and fought Germany, America simultaneously absorbed British wealth and markets. American corporations expanded into markets Britain had abandoned. While British factories produced only weapons, American factories produced weapons and consumer goods for global markets. By 1945, the wealth transfer was complete. Britain had liquidated $16 billion in overseas assets. Gold reserves had fallen from $4 billion to nearly zero. Imperial preference was signed away. Strategic bases leased to America for 99 years. And then came August 15, 1945. Japan surrendered. World War II was over. 7 days later, President Truman terminated Lend-Lease. The termination was immediate and total. American ships in the mid-Atlantic carrying food to Britain were ordered to turn around. The aid stopped instantly. No transition period, no warning, complete cutoff. The British government was paralyzed by shock. Britain's economy had been restructured for war. All factories produced weapons. Britain imported half its food, all paid for with Lend-Lease dollars. Without those dollars, Britain was instantly bankrupt. John Maynard Keynes, Britain's greatest economist, calculated that Britain faced immediate economic collapse. Food imports would stop. Rations would be cut to starvation levels. Mass unemployment, social collapse. Britain had one option: beg for an American loan. In September 1945, Keynes, dying from heart disease, sailed to Washington. He had a plan. He would argue for justice. Britain had fought alone for 2 years while America remained neutral. Britain had bankrupted itself, saving Western civilization. Therefore, America owed Britain a gift, a grant of $6 billion, not a loan, but retroactive payment for Britain's sacrifice. When Keynes arrived in Washington, he discovered justice was not a currency Americans recognized. The war was over. American voters were tired of paying for Europe. Congress was suspicious of Britain's new Labor government and its socialist policies. The Americans offered a loan, not a grant. Amount $3.75 billion, barely enough to prevent starvation. And it came with conditions designed to strangle British economic independence. The most destructive condition: sterling convertibility. Within 1 year, Britain must make the pound fully convertible into dollars. During the war, Britain had created the sterling area. Britain paid empire countries in pounds but forbade them from converting pounds to dollars. This forced them to hold pounds and buy British goods. If the pound became convertible, everyone would immediately sell pounds to buy dollars because American goods were superior. The sterling area would collapse. British exports would collapse. Keynes knew this was a death trap. The moment convertibility was introduced, there would be a run on the pound that would drain the loan in weeks. He fought against it. But the alternative was refusing the loan, which meant starvation. Bitterly, the British Parliament accepted the loan in July 1946. It was described as financial Munich, Britain appeasing America to survive. Keynes died April 21, 1946, age 62, his heart giving out under the stress of trying to save Britain from its closest ally. On July 15, 1947, per the loan terms, Britain made the pound fully convertible. The result was exactly what Keynes predicted. The moment the window opened, there was a run on the pound. Countries rushed to convert sterling to dollars. India, Egypt, Australia, Argentina. Everyone wanted dollars. The American loan began evaporating. In just 5 weeks, Britain lost $700 million of the $375 billion loan. On August 20, 1947, just 35 days after convertibility began, Britain suspended it. Britain had burned through nearly 20% of the loan for nothing. The humiliation was total, and the financial weakness triggered immediate geopolitical consequences. In February 1947, Britain sent a telegram to the U.S. State Department. For a century, Britain had guaranteed Greek and Turkish independence against Russia, but Britain was broke. The telegram said, "We're leaving. If you want to stop the Soviets, you do it." This triggered the Truman Doctrine. America replaced Britain in Greece and Turkey. It was formal acknowledgement that Britain was no longer a superpower. In 1949, Britain devalued the pound 30%, from $4.03 to $2.80. Overnight, British citizens became 30% poorer relative to the world. But the final insult was the debt itself. The Anglo-American loan was not forgiven. It was commercial debt with 2% interest. Compound interest over 60 years transformed $3.75 billion into $7.5 billion total repayment. Every year for 60 years, the British Treasury wrote checks to the U.S. Treasury. Through prosperity and crisis, through Thatcher and Blair, the payments continued. Final payment, December 29, 2006. 60 years after victory, British taxpayers still paying for having survived World War II. But the loan payments were just the visible debt. Total wealth transfer from Britain to America, 1940 to 2006. Gold reserves liquidated, $4 billion. Overseas investments sold, $12 billion. American Viscose and Company's $2 billion. Lost income from sold investments, $30 billion over 60 years. Imperial preference dismantled, $200 billion in lost trade. Strategic bases leased 99 years, incalculable. Loan repayment $7.5 billion total, approximately $250 billion in 1940s dollars, $450 billion today. And who benefited? Not the American public. Specific American institutions, the investment banks that bought British assets at fire sale prices. J.P. Morgan and Chase organized the American Viscose sale, collecting fees on every transaction. The American corporations that captured British markets while British factories only produced weapons. Ford, GM, GE, Standard Oil expanded globally while Britain was distracted. The American government, which acquired Caribbean bases, projecting power across the Western Hemisphere for 80 years. And most importantly, the architects of Bretton Woods. In July 1944, while Britain still fought Germany, American and British negotiators met in New Hampshire to design the post-war financial system. The Americans imposed a system entrenching dollar dominance. The dollar would be the world's reserve currency. The IMF and World Bank would be in Washington, controlled by American votes. The IMF would impose structural adjustment programs on countries needing loans. forcing them to open markets to American exports and sell state assets to American buyers. Keynes fought this system. He proposed an international currency called Bancor that wouldn't favor any nation. The Americans rejected it. Keynes didn't have leverage. Britain was bankrupt. The American plan was adopted. The Bretton Woods system, the IMF and World Bank, became the mechanism by which America would do to dozens of countries what it did to Britain. Between 1946 and 2025, the IMF has imposed structural adjustment programs on over 80 countries. The pattern is identical to Britain, 1940-1947. Country faces crisis. IMF offers loan with conditions. Loan requires privatization of state assets, currency convertibility, removal of trade protections. American corporations buy privatized assets at low prices. Country's industries can't compete with American imports. Country becomes permanently indebted. Mexico, Argentina, Brazil, Indonesia, Thailand, Greece, dozens more. Same playbook, same wealth transfer, same American beneficiaries. Britain helped create the system in 1944, not realizing it was the blueprint for its own dissolution. By accepting Bretton Woods, Britain legitimized the mechanism that would strip Britain and later dozens of other nations. The irony is profound. Britain defeated Nazi Germany but surrendered to American financial domination. Germany lost the war and was destroyed, then rebuilt with Marshall Plan aid that didn't have to be repaid. Britain won the war and paid for 60 years. This is the hidden history of World War II. The military history shows Allied victory. The financial history shows American acquisition of global dominance through systematic asset stripping of its closest ally. Britain emerged as a moral giant, but an economic pygmy. Britain had done the right thing, stood alone against Hitler, sacrificed everything to save Western civilization. But the price was the future. Britain sold the empire to pay for survival. The gold, investments, bases, trading system, all transferred to America. Not through conquest, but through contracts signed under duress. And the mechanisms established to strip Britain became standard procedure for American economic dominance for 80 years. When you hear about IMF loans with conditions attached, you're watching the 1946 Anglo-American loan reenacted. When countries are forced to privatize state industries, you're watching American vice coast reenacted. When currency crises trigger capital flight, you're watching the 1947 sterling crisis reenacted. The British experience wasn't unique. It was the template still used today. Same debt trap, same forced asset sales, same wealth extraction, different countries being stripped by the same system created in 1944 and 1946. If this showed you that World War II's real story was financial, not military, that Britain didn't lose the war but lost its empire paying for victory, and that the mechanism used on Britain became the IMF playbook used on 80-plus countries, subscribe. Because the next video shows which countries are being stripped right now using this exact system, which American institutions are profiting, and why $3.9 trillion in global debt is this mechanism operating at planetary scale. The Anglo-American loan extracted $450 billion from Britain over 60 years. The global debt system extracts $15 trillion annually from the entire world. Understanding Britain 1940-2006 is understanding the system controlling every debtor nation today. The mechanism doesn't change.